Hi, this is Nicole Epstein. I'm the General Counsel and Legislative Liaison for the Missouri Department of Higher Education, and I am here to walk through the proposed HESFA calculations based upon Senate Bill 807 and 577 that was passed during the regular 2018 session. So Chapter 173-1003 relates to the Higher Education Student Funding Act. And so essentially, before Senate Bill 807 and 577 was passed, public institutions of higher education were limited to raising their tuition and required fees for Missouri undergraduate students to just that of CPI. However, Senate Bill 807 and 577 added the language that you see in red. So it allows institutions to raise beyond CPI. They can raise by plus a percentage of not more than 5% that would produce an increase in net tuition revenue no greater than the dollar amount by which the state operating support was reduced for the prior fiscal year. So if a public institution's state operating support was reduced, then it allows institutions to raise tuition an additional percentage to help recoup that amount that was reduced in their state operating support. So this is an overview of the variables involved. So we're going to look at fiscal year 17 core amount dispersed, fiscal year 18 core amount dispersed, fiscal year 19 fall 2018 Missouri undergraduate enrollment, fiscal year 19 tuition and fees for Missouri undergraduates, as well as fiscal year 20 CPI. So these variables span the course of 4 fiscal years. So our first step is to determine whether state operating support was reduced for the prior fiscal year. We will first look at the term state operating support, and then we will look at the term prior fiscal year. So what is state operating support? The statute defines the term as the funding actually dispersed from state operating appropriations to approved public institutions and shall not include appropriations of disbursement for special initiatives or specific program additions or expansions. So it's important to look at the words actually dispersed. Institutions won't know the actual dispersed amount until June 30th when the fiscal year ends, so we'll have to look at fiscal year 18 instead of fiscal year 19. It's also important to look at the language shall not include appropriations of disbursement for special initiatives or specific program additions or expansions. So this means we will only look at the institution's dispersed core funding. So the term state operating support as used within this section refers to fiscal year 18 core funding dispersed to an institution. So how do we determine if a reduction occurred? The statute states that we need to look at the dollar amount by which the state operating support was reduced for the prior fiscal year. So we just said that state operating support is equal to fiscal year 18 core funding dispersed to an institution. And then we also need to look at prior fiscal year. So this means that we need to compare fiscal year 17 core dispersed to fiscal year 18 core dispersed to determine if a reduction in state operating support occurred. So if we determine that state operating support was not reduced, then there is no change in process. Institutions will be limited to raising their tuition and required fees to that of CPI. So if we determine that state operating support was reduced, then we have a new process. Institutions can raise tuition by CPI plus X, and X is equal to a percentage of not more than 5% that would produce an increase in net tuition revenue no greater than the dollar amount by which state operating support was reduced for the prior fiscal year. So X is what we have to calculate now. So in determining X, we need to know the dollar amount by which state operating support was reduced for the prior fiscal year. And so the dollar amount is equal to fiscal year 18 core dispersed minus fiscal year 17 core dispersed. So to determine the increase in net tuition revenue that will recoup the reduction in state operating support, we will need to divide the dollar amount by the number of Missouri resident undergraduate students. So to determine the number of Missouri resident undergraduate students, we have two options. We can look at fiscal year 20 estimated enrollment or fiscal year 19 fall 2018 actual enrollment. We have determined that fiscal year 19 fall 2018 actual enrollment would be the most accurate number given that institutions would need their estimated enrollment by January of 2019 for fiscal year 20. And since it relates to net tuition revenue, we cannot simply divide the reduced dollar amount by the number of students to find X. We need to focus on the terms net tuition revenue. So how do we determine net tuition revenue? The statute defines this as the net amount of resident undergraduate tuition and required fees reduced by institutional aid only. Furthermore, the statute defines institutional aid as including all aid awarded to the student by the student's institution of higher education only from such institution's funds. It does not include the following: Pell Grants, state awards such as the Missouri Higher Education Academic Scholarship Program, the A-Plus Schools Program, and the Access Missouri Financial Aid Program. It does not include foundation scholarships or third-party scholarships, nor does it include employee independent fee waivers and student loans. It's important to note that this definition of net tuition revenue is the same definition that is used in performance funding. When we look at the language all aid awarded to the student by the student's institution of higher education only from such institution's funds, that means that we need to collect the discount rate for each institution and add that rate to the overall per student increase that we just found out. So this number yields the total allowable per student increase to recoup the amount reduced in state operating support. Now X is a percentage that recoups the amount that state operating support was reduced. So how do we determine X? So the statute states that institutions can raise by CPI plus a percentage of not more than 5% that would produce an increase in net tuition revenue no greater than the dollar amount by which state operating support was reduced for the prior fiscal year. So since the statute states CPI plus a percentage, we will add the total allowable per student increase to recoup the amount reduced in state operating support to the fiscal year 19 plus CPI amount. This yields the maximum allowed tuition and required fees for fiscal year 20 for Missouri undergraduate students. We will then convert that number into a percentage increase above fiscal year 19 plus CPI. The increase above fiscal year 19 plus CPI cannot exceed the statutory cap of 5%. This means that your maximum allowed tuition required fees to recoup that loss in state operating support cannot be greater than 5% of your post-CPI amount. So now that I've walked through the rationale for choosing the data points that we did, I'd like to do an Excel demonstration to show you how the formula works. So let's say that fiscal year 19 tuition and fees at your institution is $6,000 and that fiscal year 20 CPI is 2.2%. So the maximum allowable fiscal year 20 tuition and fees would be $6,132 for fiscal year 20 based upon this scenario. So if your institution did not experience a reduction in state operating support, you would stop here. You would only be allowed to raise tuition by CPI. This is how we have always calculated HESFA in the past. However, if your institution did experience a reduction in state operating support, then we would continue on to find the additional percentage that you are allowed to raise beyond just CPI. So let's say that your institution experienced a $1 million reduction in state operating support when comparing the fiscal year 18 core to the fiscal year 17 core. Let's also say that your Missouri undergraduate enrollment was 7,500 for fall 2018. So the new allowable additional per student increase would be $133.33. Now this is before accounting for the discount rate. And we calculated this number by dividing the $1 million that was reduced in state operating support by the 7,500 enrollment number. Since the statute focuses on net tuition revenue, we'll need to know your institution-specific discount rate. So let's say that your institution's discount rate is 25%. So the new allowable per student increase is $166.67. And we calculated this by adding 25% to the previous $133.33 amount that we calculated. So the final maximum allowed tuition and fees for fiscal year 20 that your institution can charge would be $6,298.67. And we calculated this by adding the $166.67 to the $6,132. So the statute states that you get CPI plus a percentage. So therefore, we allow you to raise tuition by $132 to account for CPI, as well as the $166.67 to account for your loss in state operating support. So the final step is that we have to calculate the percent increase above fiscal year 19 plus CPI to ensure that it does not exceed the statutory cap of 5%. So the $6,298.67 amount is 2.7% greater than your post-CPI amount of $6,132, which means that the new maximum allowed tuition for fiscal year 20 to recoup your amount in state operating support that was reduced is acceptable because it only is 2.7% greater than your post-CPI amount. So it is under that 5% cap. So I know what I went over is a lot to digest. So once you've had some time to let it sink in, please do reach out with any feedback that you have on the process or any questions that come up as we were walking through the PowerPoint. My contact information you can find here, or you can reach out to another one of us within the department. I look forward to hearing from you. Thanks for listening.